So I'm David Hempton, Dean of the Harvard Divinity School. Welcome to the final session of our monthly Religions and the Practice of Peace colloquium for this academic year, Harvard Divinity School's bicentennial year. So thank you for joining us for tonight's event, which RPP is pleased to be co-sponsoring with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I'd like to especially thank our speaker, David Cortright, who you can see on screen. David has had an adventurous day today, traveling from Notre Dame, managed to get from South Bend to Detroit, and then got marooned in Detroit with flights cancelled to Boston. So a lot of flights cancelled coming into Boston today from all kinds of places, and unfortunately Detroit was one of them. So David had the pleasure of flying back to South Bend again, where he is in his office in Notre Dame. So it's a long way to go just to get to base camp. So I'm really tremendously grateful, David, for your day's adventure and for being willing to stay with it and be with us on Skype this evening. So we're very grateful to David. And also to our moderator and respondent, Bryan, Hehir, for taking the time to engage with us on this very important topic. I want also to thank the Carr Center and its executive director, Sushma Raman, for the center's co-sponsorship of tonight's event. And I'd also like to extend our gratitude again to Karen Budney and Al Budney for their very generous support for RPP, and as always to the graduate students and staff on our RPP team. So our topic tonight is Beyond Militarization, the role of religious communities in the struggle for justice and peace. As one of the most powerful nations in the world, the United States has an enormous impact on world affairs and on the life circumstances and relationships of people, both here in the US and right around the globe. What has been the impact of US policies and approaches to matters of conflict and peace? What kinds of approaches make for peace that is truly sustainable? Can peace and security be attained without equal attention to justice? What are the spiritual and ethical dimensions of all these questions? How might religious communities, with their millennia of wisdom on peace practice and their tremendous energies in global scope, help advance approaches to US domestic and foreign policy that are enlightened and intelligent and fostering equitable relationships and peace among our human family in the immediate and long term? So these are momentous and difficult questions in which all of us as global citizens have a stake, and a kind of introspection and self-examination that those of us at a key institution of intellectual leadership in the US, such as Harvard, have an urgent responsibility to undertake in earnest. So they're fitting questions for us to be asking at Harvard Divinity School at the culmination of our bicentennial year and as we proceed into the Divinity School's third century. This topic must remain central to RPP's explorations with our colleagues across the university and with members of the many different communities across the US and around the world who have an immediate moral and indeed life or death stake in these matters. So we see tonight then as just one small step in an ongoing conversation that we look forward to continuing and expanding next year and in the years ahead. So now it's my great pleasure to turn the session over to my friend and colleague and Dean Survivor at Harvard Divinity School, a very small group of enlightened and tough people. So delighted to have Bryan back as moderator and respondent this evening. Professor Hehir is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. His research and writing over many years has focused on ethics and foreign policy and the role of religion in world politics and in American society. He previously served on the faculty of Georgetown University and then here at Harvard Divinity School. His writings include The Moral Measurement of War, A Tradition of Continuity and Change, Military Intervention and National Sovereignty, Catholicism and Democracy, and Social Values and Public Policy, a contribution from a religious tradition. So we're delighted, Bryan, to have you back with us here at HDS, and thank you for moderating our session tonight. Welcome back. Thank you.
David, thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. It's always good to come back to HDS. It's a home, and it's delightful to be here during the celebration of the bicentennial. I also want to notice that as we gather here tonight, the world is not peaceful. And that is so self-evident that it highlights the significance of what we tried to do this night and what the Divinity School is trying to do in the Religions and the Practice of Peace program. As I thought about the introduction that would be appropriate to the program before I introduced David Cortright, the idea of place came to my mind in different ways. The place of Harvard Divinity School within Harvard University, the place of this program, Religions and the Practice of Peace, within the Divinity School, and then the place we're in at this evolution of the international system as we see it in April of this year. The place of the Divinity School within the wider ambit of Harvard. There are many places where the questions of war and peace are studied in this university, and they're studied from different angles. Oftentimes, the study is highly empirical and complex. But issues of war and peace are never simply solved. They are measured by the way we treat the intersection of empirical complexity and normative values, whether those normative values are derived from religious traditions or from what one might call the tradition of reason. And so the first significance of the evening is we think of ourselves as part of the wider university at Harvard and having a distinctive contribution to make from this place in the university. Secondly, there is the program that Dean Hempton has so creatively begun here at Harvard Divinity School, Religions and the Practice of Peace. When I came here over 40 years ago to study questions of war and peace, there were professors doing excellent work from whom I learned things that continue to influence me to this day. But there was nothing like this organized effort of the religions and the practice of peace to bring together people who were doing excellent work individually, but you always get a greater impact when there's a systemic organization of talent. So the place of the Divinity School within the university, the place of this program within the Divinity School, and then the place where we stand in the international system today. Simply to look around us today is to see not only how complex, but in many ways how violent the world is that we're part of. So tonight, Syria is on our mind. Tonight, Korea is on our mind. Tonight, South Sudan should be on our minds. Different ways in which the human community is in conflict. And that conflict doesn't yield easily to religion, to reason, to politics, or to military force. But all of those sources of thinking about war and peace are necessary. There is no one way to an answer to the complexity of the globe as we know it. And so we have no better guide, I think, than to look for answers from a normative perspective than from Professor David Cortright of Notre Dame University. I'm delighted to introduce David Cortright because I have been on panels with him for so many times that I literally tried to count them and I couldn't. So I can guarantee you from experience that the treatment tonight will be equal to the complexity of the topic. David is the Director of Policy Studies and Peace Accords matrix at Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and he's also the special advisor for policy studies at the newly founded Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame. He is the author or co-author or co-editor of 20 books, including Civil Society, Peace and Power, Gandhi and Beyond, Peace, A History of Movements and Ideas. Dr. Cortright has written widely about nonviolent social change, peace, nuclear disarmament, and the use of multilateral sanctions and incentives as tools of international peacemaking. He has a long history of public advocacy for disarmament and the prevention of war. As an active duty soldier during the Vietnam War, he spoke out against that conflict. He examined the history and impact of anti-war resistance in his 1975 book, Soldiers in Revolt. In 1978, Dr. Cortright was named the executive director of SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which under his leadership became the largest disarmament organization in the United States. And so it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to you my good friend, David Cortright, and I promise you an interesting evening.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Bryan, Father Hehir, and also Dean Hempton for the opportunity to be with you this evening. I earnestly wished that I could be with you in person. I tried today, traversing the length and breadth of Detroit Airport, looking for a flight that might find its way towards Boston, but alas, the weather did not allow. So I dutifully flew back to South Bend, and here I am in my office. So it's a great honor, and especially to be introduced by my dear friend and colleague, Father Hehir, whose writings and insights on issues of peace and disarmament have been influential in my life for a very long time. His writings are really of great significance in the nuclear debate and in the understanding of war and peace issues. As I think many of you know, he was the principal author of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' pastoral letter in 1983, The Challenge of Peace, a document that remains today extremely relevant and incisive, a brilliant encapsulation of social thinking and ethics on the critical issues of war and peace. And that letter was praised widely when it first came out. George Kennan wrote in the New York Times that it was the most profound and searching inquiry yet conducted by any responsible collective body into the relations of nuclear weapons, and indeed of modern war in general. So his writing and his thought has been influential in my life, and I'm very grateful to be here with you again, Bryan, on another platform. Tonight, what I wanted to do is begin with a little bit of my story and how I became involved in the study and practice of peacemaking, the influence of Gandhi. I want to dwell quite a bit on the influence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., especially this week being the 50th anniversary of his landmark address, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And I want to reflect upon that oration and its influence and relevance for today. I'll say a few words about Pope Francis and his New Year's message of peace this year and its impact and relevance for our time. And then some thoughts about the meaning of human security, of a holistic understanding of security that's derived from our understanding of peacemaking. So I became interested in peace, and my interest in peacemaking was the result of being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. Very unusual, ironic way to become a peacemaker, I guess, or a peace activist and scholar. I graduated from Notre Dame in 1968, and it was an unfortunate time to be an available young man in America. And I was quickly drafted and within a few weeks of graduating, was in the Army. And that experience profoundly changed my life in ways that I had no imagination would possibly occur in that way. War came knocking on my door, and it forced me to think about issues of peace. And I realized quickly that this war was unjust, that the American cause did not pass moral muster in my thinking. And I began to feel that I was being asked to participate in a war that was so profoundly unjust and cruel that I could not continue with business as usual. So I began to speak out for peace as an active duty soldier. And that changed my life. As you can imagine, our military commanders were not exactly happy with our speaking out. That's a long story. I could regale you all night with stories about speaking out for peace while you're in the Army. But the most important point for us is that it set me on a path of working for peace. And maybe we can go to the slide number 2, and you can see this image of me almost 50 years ago. This was one of the few things that I could do to speak out. I was asked to pose for this poster for the anti-war movement. And so I went down to New York one day with my uniform. And I don't know if you can see the signature on the side of that photo image, but that's the great Richard Avedon. At the time, I didn't know who he was. I was nervous and very inexperienced young person trying to do the right thing in terms of speaking against the war. But it was a great opportunity to meet him. And this poster really is not about me. It's about the thinking soldier. It's about the many soldiers and vets who spoke out against the war during that time. This is one of the least known, but arguably one of the more significant aspects of the Vietnam-era anti-war movement, the very widespread opposition to war among active duty soldiers and veterans, including, of course, Vietnam veteran John Kerry, who was a leader of Vietnam Veterans Against the War during those days. So I wrote about that experience as my PhD dissertation, and it became the book Soldiers in Revolt. Next slide, please. So this is I wrote it in 1975, and then it was republished in 2005, and that's the edition you see before you. But as you become involved in peace, inevitably you encounter the figure of Gandhi, and in all the anti-war groups that I was part of, there would be the photo of Gandhi on the wall, and many quotes and references to Gandhi, but not much real depth explanation. So I embarked on a lifelong study of Gandhi, traveled to India several times, went to the Gandhi Museum near the Rajghat in Delhi, and began to really try to absorb the wisdom and insight of Gandhi. Many things that we could talk about, but I think most relevant to me was to understand how he molded the idea of nonviolence into a tool of social change. Nonviolence was not simply a matter of relations among individuals, but could be molded into a social political force to achieve historic political change, as he did in India. And before that, during his time in South Africa in fighting against the racist regulations against the Asian community that were imposed during his time there. Gandhi taught us about the use of nonviolence as a tool for fighting to achieve justice. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in many people about nonviolence and the Gandhian method. It's so often equated with pacifism, but really that's not what motivated Gandhi. He resorted to this method because he wanted to fight against the racial prejudices that he and his community faced in South Africa. And from there, he devised the many strategic principles that have since spread throughout the world and become very widespread in many different countries. Gandhi practiced a kind of spiritual politics. He said that he tried to combine these two seemingly completely separate walks of life, politics and spiritual pursuits for truth, but he felt that he had to adopt a spiritual position in order to try to achieve the goals of justice that he pursued during his public career. He combined these two in a significant and important way. He devised this concept of satyagraha, the pursuit of truth, holding up for truth. And I find this emphasis on truth especially relevant and important for us today, living in a political age of alternative news, of fake news, alternative facts, and how important it is to pursue truth and to hold on to the importance of evidence and factual representation at this time in our history and in the kind of politics we're seeing from the White House. But I found Gandhi, as I say, tremendously influential in my life, and that really set me on the path of understanding and trying to apply nonviolent action in a more systematic way. Next slide is the cover of my book, Gandhi and Beyond, and this is what I use in my courses to try to help students understand the depth of nonviolence as not simply a philosophy, but as actually a tool of action. And to understand how it can be applied to bring about social and political change. Through all of this study, I've been greatly influenced by a number of other authors, by our own Scott Appleby here at the University of Notre Dame, now the Dean of the Keough School, and his important book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, helped me, and I'm sure many of you understand the depth of religion and its influence on war and peace, and the ways in which we see so often in the world today that religion is used as a way of justifying the most irreligious and cruel of forms of violence. But how also religion can be an inspiration for peace building and can be the source that motivates many of us to strive for peace in a world that is so often violent, to strive for peace when we see so much war around us. And I do think that the teachings of religion, not just our Christian tradition, but of Islam and Judaism and other faith traditions, really contain the tools, the insights, the inspiration that can motivate us for peacemaking. But I think for me then, as I studied more deeply and saw the influence of Gandhi in our own country through Dr. Martin Luther King, I began to see the relevance more concretely. Maybe in the next slide, the image of Dr. King at the March on Washington, 1963, and his famous oration for civil rights. King was the one who took the Gandhian method and applied it to the Christian tradition of his own faith experience, and then taught us in the United States how to take this concept and use it as a tool for fighting against the injustices of racial segregation. King's influence was great on so many of us. Maybe we go to the next slide. King also had his own sense of spiritual politics, of course, and really tried to bring the teachings of Christian gospel, principles of love, into the struggle against racial segregation, against militarism, against poverty in this country. And I think his role is profoundly important for us. And I thought I'd especially dwell here for a few minutes on his 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. The 50th anniversary was just on Tuesday, and there were events in a number of places around the country to commemorate that historic address. And during that speech, as you know, Dr. King spoke out more publicly against the Vietnam War than he had ever done, and found it necessary to link the struggles against racism and poverty with the struggle against militarism. Dr. King was, of course, vilified for speaking out against the war that evening at New York's Riverside Church. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other newspapers editorialized against him. He was urged to stay in his lane and focus only on civil rights. Dr. King, what do you know about war and peace? Stay focused on the civil rights struggle. President Johnson, with whom King had developed a very important relationship, Johnson cut him off from the White House and from all access after that. And even leaders of the established civil rights organizations, the NAACP and their Urban League, rebuked Dr. King for speaking out and for hurting the movement as they saw it. And Dr. King certainly understood that he would pay a price for speaking out against the war, but he felt compelled to speak out. He could see that militarism and war abroad were undermining the struggle against poverty and racism at home. He watched the Johnson administration's anti-poverty program, the War on Poverty, very creative initiatives that were underway at that time, as he put it, broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything on a society gone mad on war, unquote. Dr. King knew that America could never really invest sufficiently to fight against poverty and racism as long as the war in Vietnam continued to take resources from our country. He described it as a demonic, destructive suction tube, taking the life out of the War on Poverty programs and undermining the hopes of the movement for freedom and an end to racial injustice here in this country. In that speech, Dr. King gave a very deep and profound analysis, not only of the war itself, but of what he called the deeper malady within the American spirit that led to this kind of military adventurism, an arrogance and indifference to the strivings for freedom that are so prevalent around the world, and especially in that revolutionary age when the struggle against colonialism was so active across Africa and many other parts of the world. And instead of being in support of that struggle for freedom, so often the United States has been a force for repression, for military intervention, often on behalf of the most reactionary regimes that suppress strivings for justice and make armed insurrections almost inevitable. And Dr. King warned that a nation like ours that spends so much on the military, while often neglecting the needs of society, that kind of country is approaching spiritual death. And I would submit that today we face some of these same kinds of problems. The White House has proposed, as you know, a national budget that will increase already very high levels of military spending in this country, more than $600 billion in total. He wants to increase that by another $54 billion. And at the same time has called for slashing social spending programs here at home and cut back on programs for humanitarian assistance and development aid overseas and for diplomacy. So we face a similar problem of militarism undermining the prospects for social justice and indeed even for the more effective means of preventing armed conflict around the world that I'll mention here in a moment. And we're militarized not just in the sense of the budget of our country, but in the way in which our military today remains so engaged in many places around the world. We're still bogged down after 15 years in a seemingly endless war in Afghanistan. U.S. forces have been sent back into Iraq. 5,000 or 6,000 American troops are now on the ground, quote, advising and working with Iraqi forces in the battle against ISIS. American troops are now being sent back in a similar advisory role into Syria. And who knows what action the president may be contemplating at this very moment. We see stories this afternoon of some possible military action because of the gas weapons, chemical weapons attack in Syria the other day. American forces are also on the ground in Yemen and Somalia and Libya in small numbers, but actively involved in advising forces that are fighting there. And our warplanes and drone aircraft are engaged in widespread bombing attacks across the region. At least six countries being bombed as we speak this evening. So we really see a policy of military engagement in which the use of military force remains the response that the United States makes to addressing the problems that exist around the world. Certainly, ISIS and the terrorist groups of similar type are a threat. They conduct heinous acts. But we know that the use of military force alone is not sufficient to undermine these groups. And indeed, excessive American military involvement often feeds the recruitment of more supporters for these kinds of groups. If we think about the nuclear issue, here again we see dangerous trends in terms of the president's commitment to, quote, massively, unquote, increase our nuclear weapons capability. And plans are underway. They were approved under the Obama administration, and they're now preparing to spend massive amounts of money, up to $100 billion over the coming 10 to 15 years, to rebuild all of our land-based nuclear weapons missile programs. Doing this despite the advice of former Defense Secretary William Perry, who wrote last year in the New York Times that these weapons could be safely scrapped as an unnecessary and dangerous relic of the Cold War. And yet we continue to build up these nuclear weapons. So, like King before us, we face challenges of militarism, and I think have the responsibility to speak out boldly against these militaristic policies and see the linkages between the fight against war and militarism and the struggles against poverty and racism here at home. I wanted to say a word or two about our Catholic teaching on these issues, and especially the message of Pope Francis. We had a speaker here the other night on campus and gave a very gloomy picture of the state of conflict in the world today and militarism and the threats from global climate change. And one of the students got up and said, well, sir, do you find any hope? Who is the most inspiring voice in the world today? And immediately the speaker said, Pope Francis. And certainly we feel that way here very much. His encyclical, Laudato Si, on the dual threat of the exploitation of the poor and the marginalized society and the exploitation of the environment, and the linkage between these two forms of domination has been inspiring for people all around the world. Here at Notre Dame, we spent the better part of last year teaching and studying that encyclical in classrooms and conferences throughout the different departments here at the university. And Pope Francis has also spoken out on issues of war and peace. A number of times he's used the phrase of a world war that's being fought in a piecemeal fashion. And as Father Hehir mentioned, that war has increased in recent years. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden keeps an annual index of the state of armed conflict in the world. And for a number of decades, we saw a decline, offered a sense of hope, inspired books like Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. But in the last 5 years, we've seen a reversal of that trend. There are now 6 or 7 significant wars going on in the world, wars where there are more than 1,000 casualties per year, and many other smaller armed conflicts as well. So I think Francis has the right concept here of kind of world war that's spreading ominously around the world. But in his World Day of Peace message this year, Pope Francis gave a more hopeful message. And the title was quite striking. He called it Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. I'm a little critical of that title. I think it's more than just a style. It's a method. It's a an approach that can be used to help to bring about justice and peace, as I'll say a bit more about as we go along here. But Francis, in his address, World Peace Address, rightly talked about nonviolence as a means of influencing social change, and he described it as more powerful than violence. And we know now that there is empirical data to support this. Probably some of you are familiar with the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan and their important book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And they've used the tools of quantitative analysis from political science to look at violent means of struggle versus nonviolent means of struggle, and have found that nonviolent means are far more effective than violent means in bringing about successful political change and social change in significant political struggles. And Pope Francis, without referring to their empirical studies, said this very well, and pointed out that we still don't understand very often the true strength of nonviolence. It's often described as passive resistance, definitely a misnomer. There's nothing passive about nonviolent action. Sometimes it's thought of as a form of surrender, a lack of involvement, a form of passivity, but that's not really the case. And of course, Gandhi proved that in his actions in South Africa and in India, Dr. King through the civil rights movement, many other struggles around the world. The struggles against communism in Eastern Europe in 1989 and 90, the Velvet Revolution brought down the whole Soviet communist system without a shot being fired. So we've seen many, many cases over the years of the effectiveness of this tool. And I think that we can see that through nonviolent action, we have a means of struggling for justice while remaining true to religious principles. And it brings us back to Gandhi's idea of a spiritual politics. I think that the use of nonviolent action is critically necessary for us to try to bring forth a different principle of security in the world and of understanding the ways to address the most significant threats that we face, but through means other than military force. My dear friend and colleague Jim Wallace always says that for those of us who advocate for nonviolence, we need to be able to answer the questions that violence purports to answer, but in a better and more effective way. And Dr. King said as well that those of us who advocate for nonviolence and peace need to be as effective in our policy solutions as those who are the advocates for war and the use of military force. So I wanted to dwell a bit on that. The next slide, slide 9, depicts Pope Francis at the UN a couple of years ago in his important address, in which he talked about the power of spiritual politics and the necessity for nations to restrict the development of nuclear weapons, and repeated the call of all of his predecessors in the papacy for greater steps towards the reduction and the elimination of nuclear weapons. Pope Francis also talked about the concept of integral human development. Let's go to the next slide. This is a concept that's well known in Catholic social teaching. Integral human development is the key to the full exercise of human dignity, bringing together all of the different dimensions of human life, the political, social, family, individual, economic, into a vision of human well-being, so that each individual, each family, each community and nation can have a right relationship with one another and try to achieve fulfillment and well-being and flourishing for themselves and for their communities. And this, I think, also fits into a concept of security, of human security. If you go to the next slide, the concept of holistic security that former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan so often tried to emphasize, the recognition that security cannot be achieved by military means alone, but must involve human rights, the dignity of communities, the rights of communities to speak out and to voice their views and to be able to change and hold accountable their political leadership. And also the importance of economic development, of opportunity, of providing opportunities for communities to, and for individuals to achieve fulfillment. We're just now completing a new book on governance as an essential element of security, Governance for Peace, that Cambridge University Press will be bringing out later this year. And in that book, we talk about principles of governance as they relate to human security and alternative security paradigms, recognizing that security ultimately depends upon the capacity and the quality of governance. Capacity being the ability of governments to deliver public goods equitably to all communities, to provide security and protection, yes, but also to be able to deliver social and economic opportunities, education, healthcare, the full range of social goods have to be available to really guarantee the security and well-being of communities. And at the same time, governance has to have the qualities of inclusiveness, of participation, of accountability, to foster equality among communities. And the combination of those capacities and qualities is necessary for a governance that can be more peaceful and to help communities achieve greater stability. In the next slide, I'm almost finished here. I want to outline some of the basic concepts of conflict prevention, conflict transformation that we develop in the book and that are well known. In order to prevent conflict and transform conflict, we have to be able to understand and address the political grievances that exist. And so often, communities will wrap up their struggles in religious garb and pretend that it's about defending Islam, for example. But at the core, there are underlying political grievances. We look at the case of ISIS. We know that it emerged out of the struggle of the Sunni communities in Iraq and Syria, and the desire of those communities for their rights to be heard, and a response to the repression that they experienced from the regimes in Damascus and Baghdad led to the rise of ISIS, and certainly does not justify the actions of ISIS, but in order to suppress the threat from ISIS, we have to understand and try to ameliorate those underlying political grievances. In the same way as I've just mentioned in terms of providing effective governance, quality governance, and governance that meets the needs of people is crucial. And then, of course, economic and social opportunity. We know that societies in which there is more employment, more economic opportunity, are less likely to experience armed conflict. There's a straight line relationship in econometric data between per capita income and the risk of armed conflict. The more societies can grow economically and share economic opportunity and achieve higher economic growth rates, the less likely they are to face armed conflict. So we know a lot through social science and through literature and research over the past decades. We know a lot about how to prevent armed conflict, the conditions that cause armed conflict. And we know that the use of military force is sometimes necessary. Pope Francis himself said when the Yazidi people were under attack in Syria and Iraq that use of force to protect a community that's facing imminent massacre is acceptable, is legal, is licit, as he used the term. But that's not justification for war and for continuous bombing. And so the use of force is used sometimes, but in the long term, we have to develop these alternative means of security and understand that security is not only of the state, of the nation, the traditional concept of national security, but has to be a genuine human security that tries to protect and care for the interests of individuals, of families, and of society and communities, and of groups within nations, with an understanding that so often the conflicts that are existing today are between groups within nations, between one social group and another, and it's the inequities, the marginalization of one community by another that so often leads to armed conflict. So genuine human security means building relationships among these communities, trying to foster opportunities economically, but also in terms of access to power and resources, so that communities have opportunities for human flourishing and for their own development, and that it can be done on a more equitable and shared basis. These are some of the concepts that I think are contained within the broader understanding of the idea of human security. And religion is essential for us to sustain the commitment to working for these goals. They seem utopian at times, especially in the world today and with the politics that we have in our country. And Reinhold Niebuhr, years ago, in talking about Gandhi, he actually spoke about, wrote about Gandhi and Moral Man and Immoral Society, and talked about the nonviolent method. And he tied it to his own religious writings, and he said that it takes a religious inspiration often to be committed to the kind of struggle which can seem so hopeless at times, a Sisyphean struggle for social justice in a very unjust world. And he said, it takes the sublime madness of religion. And I found that always a very compelling phrase. It's one that speaks deeply to my own motivations. We act and work for justice, for peace, despite evidence to the contrary, because it is our expression of faith. It is our belief. Our faith calls us to be engaged. And that commitment has driven my involvement in the struggle for peace through now nearly 50 years. It was certainly the motivation that inspired Dr. King and Gandhi and so many others. And I think it's the source for all of us as we strive to try to create a more just and peaceful world. Thank you very much.
So David, on behalf of the audience seated here, that we all hoped you would see face to face, let me, in their name, simply give voice to the applause that you just heard, and to thank you for a capacious address that combined personal experience and personal commitment with an academic life that has been devoted to the question of reducing the role of violence in the world. It is sufficiently capacious that in 10 minutes given to me, I don't think I'll expand at length, let me put it that way. So I do think that even the title of David's address combined the major features of what he then spelled out in much more detail. A spiritual ethic aimed at a conception of security and the effect of it being, as he described it, beyond militarization. So how to think about these things? Well, he mentioned, as I did in my opening remarks, we live in a world that is not only violent, but also complicated. And an address to the question of war and peace, which is never simple in any age, is particularly not simple in our age. We lived through 50 years of what was the nuclear age, where we had one overwhelming threat. The threat was overwhelming. It promised the possibility of the extinction of all human life if a full-fledged nuclear war took place. When the Cold War collapsed, there was enormous hope among people, scholars, politicians, and also soldiers that we were able to put behind us this enormously dangerous chapter through which we have just lived. But indeed, the post-Cold War period, while not having one cosmic threat, in a sense replaced one cosmic threat with a complexity of multiple threats. So as David referred to, the range of issues that need to be addressed today in light of human security, my own summary of it would be that the complexity of the world today is that it yields three different kinds of the use of force. There is still the classical interstate use of force that is possible, and indeed we see it in the world today. Secondly, there is the explosion of internal conflict which emerged after the Cold War and created a world in which fragmentation, in a sense, spread across the globe within countries. And then thirdly, what we saw in 9/11, transnational war by subnational groups. So you have the classical story that's as old as Thucydides of states in conflict with each other. You have the problem of civil war within states. The great French scholar Raymond Aron said, civil wars are the worst kind, the most violent, the most difficult to resolve. And then we have the phenomenon of transnational war. Now, David's approach was not to explore these issues in detail, but to look at the normative possibilities of setting limits on the use of force and redirecting the force into political ideas that contribute to human security. Those normative ideas, in a sense, rest in two different forms of scholarship, for lack of a better term. There's the question of ethics and violence in the world, and there's the question of religion and violence in the world. Normative issues are either the fruit of reason, the fruit of religious tradition, or the fruit of legal traditions. So while those three possibilities create the framework within which one could attempt to set limits to the use of force and transform conflicts into ways that can be dealt with apart from the use of force, I agree with David. It is unlikely that you can ever have a political system without the threat of force hanging over it. But it is possible to do much better than we're doing today. Ethics and violence in the world. Ethics, I take it to be the rational reflection on human nature and human experience that is designed to recognize that the use of force always has its own logic. It doesn't have its own ethic. That is to say, force without purpose, force without limits, is destructive without the possibility of being constructive. And so rational reflection on the set of limits, whether one embodies that reflection in the position that David has stood for throughout his life since his time in the military, a nonviolent position that essentially, in the style of Gandhi and King, searches for a way to marginalize the use of force in human affairs as much as possible. Or whether one holds not an absolute position of nonviolence, or, as he indicated, a distinct form of that, pacifism, but even thinks that it is part of the ethical task to decide when force is just and when it isn't. In either case, what we're trying to do is to set limits on an activity in human affairs that should never be our primary way of dealing with each other. Secondly, there is the question of religion and violence. And as David indicated, religion has a dual capacity in terms of the question of violence. Religion, on the one hand, can be transformative of the human spirit, the human imagination. Indeed, Niebuhr himself indicated that in a sense, moral imagination was central to keeping a human society human. And therefore, religion has the capability to expand the moral imagination of men and women. But religion also has the capability to be an instrument of violence. Here, David's reference to Pope Francis, this is the issue Francis has spent the most time on. While he has talked about the use of force and the search for peace, he particularly, I think, is concerned that religion can be instrumentalized as a source of violence. And therefore, I think he tries to say that the leaders of religious communities and the communities themselves need to understand that religion, in a sense, stands at a crossroads. It can be a transformative, peaceful instrument of human affairs, or it can be turned in a different direction. And therefore, religion and the use of force must deal with this double possibility. Finally, there is David's culmination of his speech in terms of the question of human security. The idea of human security has been developed over the past, I would say, 30 years systematically, because the notion of security has been so much a part of the way nations thought about their relationships with each other. Human security recognizes that security is a multi-dimensional reality. It needs to be rooted in a political vision. It needs to be crystallized in a legal framework. It needs to be directed and given purpose by values, religious or intellectual. And in any case, the goal of human security is, by definition, a security that is not simply the security of one nation. It is the security of the international community, in terms of which nations achieve their national interests and can fulfill their goals as political communities. David has taken us across all of those issues, normative issues, the descriptive account of the world in which we live, and a goal of security that expands the normal conception of security into its full development. For that, I think we're in his debt, and now I'll give you a chance to talk. I have to do this in steps. There are participants in the Religion and Practice of Peace program here, and I have been told that if I say the magic words, there will be 2 questions raised from out of that group for David and the rest of us. So I invite the designated questioners to speak now. Yes, if I can have your name. Whenever you speak, if you'll just introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Courtney Sender. I'm in the Religions and Practice of Peace course. Thank you very much for the talk. My question is, I was really interested in this idea of the thinking soldier in terms of opposition to war among active duty soldiers and veterans during Vietnam. And I'm just wondering if you think there's any kind of already discernible or even possible parallel today in terms of the discourse or the actions that are allowed or even desirable or desired among members of the military against this kind of increased militarization.
Okay, thank you. Just a suggestion, you're all asking questions slowly because the Skype doesn't come close. But I think I got the gist of your message or your question. If not, you can correct me.
Okay.
Yeah, are there parallels today in terms of the role of the military and voices from the military that are questioning the directions of militarization. Yeah, there have been, certainly not as widespread as in our day. You know, keep in mind, we were a draftee army. So today it's a volunteer army, it's very different. Soldiers sign up for longer terms, they have families that they have to take care of, etc. But nonetheless, we saw during the Iraq War the emergence of a group, Iraq Veterans Against the War, somewhat patterning themselves after John Kerry's old group, VVAW. And I also was contacted by a group of sailors and Marines based in Norfolk who wanted me to come down and talk about how they, as active duty service members, could speak out. But the style of speaking out is certainly more respectful. The military is much more professional today than it was back in our day. But I do think that that voice of conscience is there. And I also see how even many of our senior military commanders have learned through the difficult experiences of Afghanistan and Iraq, the limitations of the use of force. And they, more than anyone, have lived through the difficulties. And so many of our service members are going back for a third, fourth, and fifth tour. And even going back now again to Iraq, how disheartening that must be. And so I was struck by the letter that was released in public a couple weeks ago, right after the president released his national budget with this very distorted set of priorities that I described. And more than 120 senior flag officers, generals and admirals, wrote to the president and to members of Congress indicating that military force alone is not sufficient to counter the threats from terrorism, and that it's critically important for our security that we maintain full funding for development programs and for diplomacy. And as one of the generals said, has now become well known, in his testimony before Congress, he said, if you're going to cut diplomacy and development, you better buy us a whole lot more ammunition. I was greatly heartened by that expression from senior commanders, indicating that this understanding about the much more complex nature of security today is widely shared within the senior ranks of the military itself. And I continue to interact with military officers. Here at Notre Dame, we have a big ROTC program. And I find that many of the officers share many of the insights that we try to develop within peace studies. And there's a coming together of, in our understandings of the true nature of security and the need for a holistic, multidimensional approach to be able to counter these extremist groups and to try to end the many civil wars and internal conflicts around the world.
Thank you.
And now, second question.
Yes.
If you'd introduce yourself, please.
I'm Enoch Joseph Aboy, also a member of the RPP group. My concern is whether religious institutions do have a voice, as it was during the time of King, that is heard and respected by the government, serving as a check to government policies on the militarization and wars outside of the U.S. So do we have a religious institution that has a voice that is heard and respected? And if we do, what is that institution, or maybe a person that represents that institution? And if we don't, then do we have an alternative voice to religious institutions that could serve as check and balance for the government's policy?
So I think you were asking about the role of religious institutions in speaking out about these issues of war and peace, correct? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's critically important. And indeed, we find many of the religious bodies here in the United States speaking out courageously on these issues. I noticed that it wasn't just generals, but many religious groups that immediately responded to the president's budget by calling attention to the need for spending to address social needs here at home, and a recognition that a budget is a moral document. It is an expression of our moral commitments and priorities. And it's a sad statement that our budget is calling for more military spending and nuclear weapons rather than continuing to support social programs at home. So yes, I think religious voices are critical and have played a role historically. If I go back to the 1980s, when Father Hehir played such an important role helping to write the Challenge of Peace document, the statement from the U.S. Catholic bishops was not at all political. It never weighed into any partisan questions. It even delicately danced around the big issue at that time, which was the nuclear freeze proposition. But it nonetheless spoke forcefully and with great moral authority to the need for a reduction in nuclear weapons and for the impermissibility of any use of nuclear weapons as a sin against man and God and always unacceptable. And that statement was arguably one of the most significant influences in the debate in the 1980s that began to shift the political climate. So that President Reagan, who came in to office talking about the evil empire and vowing to continue to build up nuclear weapons, before too long began to negotiate with the Soviets and, of course, began to develop a relationship with Gorbachev that changed history. But that change at the level of national leadership, international leadership, was partly a result of a changing of the political climate here at home in the US, but similar trends were going on in Europe and other parts of the world, so that people were able to voice that concern for disarmament, for reducing the nuclear danger. And as I say, the religious communities played a central role in expressing that very widespread public desire for a reduction in nuclear weapons and an end to the nuclear dangers.
Now, I want to invite any of the other members of the Religion and Peace project first. I'm told I should offer 10 minutes to you if you have things to say, and then I'll go to the audience. Are you part of the Religion and Peace project? I think you ought to go right ahead.
Thank you first so much for giving this talk and such a timely talk too in regard with what was happening this week in Syria and in terms of like Korea. I'm Rachel, I'm from South Korea, and so my question is that when I look at all the conversations, especially about like North Korea and nuclear weapons in North Korea, in media, I saw them like portraying the Kim regime as this kind of like big, huge problem and issue, whereas like there were very little, if any, conversations addressing the cause of the division and why the Kim regime gained power in North Korea. Is like even in religious groups and even in like religious communities who are very interested in peacemaking. So like which leads to my question as a person in academia who pursues like academic studies, and as a religious person, like how can we address these problems without this attitude of like I have the answers and like kind of like looking down on people in a way. do you have any like answers for that? Because I was very frustrated with not addressing the responsibilities of how engaged U.S. and Soviet Union and Japan and China were in the division of Korea, and just seeing not to de-emphasize all the bad things that the Kim regime is doing, but to kind of like dig deeper into the cause.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, the North Korea problem is a grave one now, and it's another potential tinderbox that could lead to much wider armed conflict. I worry about what the administration may try to do in response to the publications from the Kim regime. I don't have any magical solutions, of course, but I do have a few perspectives in terms of how to address that crisis. First of all, I think there is no alternative but to negotiate. I mean, you either engage in military action, which could lead to very widespread armed conflict and disaster for the peninsula, for the people of Korea, or you negotiate. And so it seems to me absolutely necessary that a diplomatic strategy be developed and we get back to the bargaining table with the regime and try to work out an agreement. It's important for people to remember that for a brief time in the 1990s, there was an agreement. The so-called agreed framework that was negotiated in 93 and 94 did bring a halt to the Korean nuclear program, North Korean nuclear program for a time. And the U.S. did begin to provide some support for the people of North Korea, but unfortunately that agreement was not sustained. Fault lies on both sides of the bargain. The U.S. did not live up to its part of the bargain in terms of providing sufficient economic assistance, and the construction of new, more proliferation-proof kinds of reactors did not proceed. And then, of course, the North also cheated, as we found out, while constraining their plutonium-based program, went ahead and developed a uranium-based program. So the talks broke down. But that's the nature of diplomacy. You know, we have our Peace Accords Matrix program in Notre Dame. We study peace accords, and we know that the road of peace negotiation is never smooth. It's always bumpy, always breaks. But if persisted at and if applied strategically over time, diplomacy can help to restrain nuclear dangers. The Iran nuclear agreement is an outstanding example of that, I would submit. A negotiation that managed to impose quite significant constraints on the Iranian nuclear program, and that has also provided some incentive for the Iranians through the opening of trade, especially by the Europeans. We'll see whether U.S. companies are able to begin trade. I know Boeing has a big deal in the works on providing civilian aircraft. But that's a successful approach, and it can tell us the potential benefit of a diplomatic strategy with North Korea. It'll be complex and difficult, certainly many differences between the two cases, but I don't see any alternative. I think there have been many indications from the North what they would like to see. You know, they would like to see, first of all, an end to the state of war that still exists between our two countries, an end to the frequent military exercises, which they see as threats, provocations. And I don't see why we couldn't agree to that, so long as it was combined with a tightly monitored restriction on nuclear and ballistic missile provocations from the North. Certainly that should be a kind of a bargain that would be in our own interest and certainly in theirs. The key is more effective verification and monitoring. But here we see that the Iran agreement is very significant, not only in its ability to, for the moment, constrain the Iranian program, but in the precedent that it establishes for a very intrusive, the most intrusive on-site inspection regime ever established. And that should be the same standard that we would seek in a diplomatic arrangement with the North. Ultimately, we have to see North Korea as not just a one person, a Kim leadership. It's a nation of people, and there are interests, and there are many economic and social difficulties within North Korea. So can we begin to explore ways in which we could address the needs of the Korean people as part of a bargain that could, at the same time, restrain the nuclear program? And really, we need to normalize political relations with the regime. We don't like our political system, understandably, but it's in the interest of international peace and security to normalize relations, and that could be done, I think, in the context of a bargain around the nuclear program. So those are just a few thoughts that could be helpful.
Here, Sophia?
Good evening. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My name is Sophia. I'm a first-year MDiv candidate here, and also a participant in the RPP class. You referenced a couple of times the disturbing move of the administration to increase our military spending. And there's been a fairly significant, I think, outcry against that. I have had the tremendous learning experience over the past few years to work with the American Friends Service Committee closely with groups like Peace Action and UFPJ, which are of a specific type of peace movement folks. But through that work have been exposed to the fact that, in fact, our military has been expanding and expanding to unbelievable levels, equal to the next 8 largest military spenders combined is one example, with 800 military bases around the world, which is unprecedented. I really appreciate you assigning the Beyond Vietnam speech because it is so relevant. The issues feel so much the same reading that history and the kind of cultural analysis. And I find it interesting that King refers to the 3 evils: racism, militarism, and poverty, which he also describes as extreme materialism, as constituting this deeper malady. And I wonder if you could speak to the kind of cultural shift that needs to happen in this country, perhaps, which, you know, the policy I would describe as this hubris of somehow we can outsmart and create stability through the military policies that you've kind of expanded on, or that there is a logic, there is a balance here that can be created through massive military might. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments and question. Yeah, I do think we need a profound cultural shift in our country. And that needs to come from an understanding of how difficult it is for us to be critics of militarism. Even to say the word militarism is often frowned upon. I doubt that it ever gets uttered around Congress or in the corridors of Washington, because it conjures up images of Nazism and stormtroopers and Gestapo, etc. But we are sadly a militaristic country in terms of where our priorities are and how we so often use military force as the primary instrument of policy rather than a last resort. So your question is well taken. I think we need a cultural shift in a couple of dimensions, and I'll offer a couple avenues for that, perhaps. One is that so often a criticism of military policy is confused with a criticism of the soldiers. And everywhere in our culture, and in my unsuccessful travel by plane today, in the airports, always the announcements are thanking our troops and inviting them to come to a service center in the airports. And that's appropriate. But I always think to myself, why don't we also thank those individuals who sacrifice to go work in humanitarian agencies abroad with Catholic Relief or Mercy Corps or any of these groups, or peace builders who go abroad and are working today in South Sudan or in many other countries, the Philippines, to try to foster dialogues between communities that are in conflict, often at some considerable personal risk. So there are many ways that one can sacrifice for security and for our nation and for the world. But nonetheless, this deep respect for our troops is a reality of our culture, and it sometimes impedes our ability to provide necessary criticism of military policy. So my point here would be to try to help our fellow citizens differentiate between these two. It's totally possible and necessary to support the troops in terms of providing adequate compensation, a better GI Bill. There is now a good GI Bill for educational benefits for those who come out of the military. And I'm proud to say that some of the groups that were opposed to the Iraq invasion and then the occupation, Win Without War, Friends Committee on National Legislation, and others, all of us also supported the effort that was adopted in 06 and 07 to improve the GI Bill so that service members would get a real opportunity to have a university education after they get out of the military. So separating these two things, the support for the military for veterans is one thing, but support for an endless and unwinnable war in Afghanistan is not the same as that. That's a separate matter. And many of those who served in those theaters would be the first to admit that these are unwinnable missions that should be ended. Same thing with all of the military hardware and with these nuclear weapons. Really, for what conceivable purpose could we want to rebuild all of our land-based missiles, spend more than 100 or in the range of $100 billion to take all those silos, rebuild them, when we don't need them to begin with? And of course, the gold-plated weapon systems of the military, gold-plated not literally, but in terms of the cost of these weapon systems, $75, $100 million per aircraft, several billions of dollars for these aircraft carriers. So unnecessary weapon systems. So we can focus on that part of the military policy as unnecessary and in some cases inimical to our national security. As I say, the continuous military engagement and occupation of countries, long-term engagement in Afghanistan, only feeds the radical recruitment that leads to further strength of the Taliban or the ISIS forces in Iraq and Syria. So that's one big cultural challenge that we face, of separating out the question of supporting troops from a critical stance on the military. Another and related issue is the question of patriotism and how we understand peace advocacy and peacemaking in the light of our love of country. And Dr. King, not in the address on April 4, '67, but in a address on the same theme a week later, talked at some length about his commitment to America and his statement that I opposed the war in Vietnam because I love America. And that particular phrase is etched on the King Monument in Washington, D.C. I opposed the war in Vietnam because I love America. And I think that's a theme that we in the peace movement and those who support peace building can and should adopt. It doesn't mean we succumb to narrow nationalism or militarism at all. It says that we stand for the higher ideals for which this country is supposed to stand. And Dr. King, again, was very eloquent in emphasizing that the highest form of patriotism is a critical embrace of our country's higher ideals and a criticism of the excessive militarism. And as he said, I speak out against the war in Vietnam, not out of anger, but out of sadness and disappointment. And there can be no disappointment where there is not great love. We want our country to stand for its principles, not to be the face of bombs and weaponry and military forces of militarism around the world. And then let me say that also I think that we need a cultural shift within the peace movements. You know, within groups like Peace Action, and you know, I used to be part of Peace Action when it was Sane Freeze, and too often we belittle and dismiss the military, don't recognize, especially today, as I mentioned earlier, that there are growing numbers of people in the military because of the bitter experience of Afghanistan and Iraq, who agree with us on many things, on the need for more diplomacy, on the need for more development assistance, for peace building as a legitimate contribution to security in settings of conflict. So we need to be respectful of the military in the sense of, as I said earlier, supporting and acknowledging their service, and try to find dialogue with the military. I've found a growing number of ways in which those of us who work for peace and development can find colleagues in the military services who agree with us, and we can find ways of cooperating towards achieving a more holistic version of security.
So now we go to the wider audience as a whole, and according to the design of the program, we have about 20 minutes. So people usually come to the Divinity School, want to talk. So I am going to invite you to keep your questions crisp so we can have a sort of democratization of the dialogue, and people will be able, more people will be able to speak. So I think we have 2 microphones. All righty. Just like, if you'd introduce yourself and then just...
Yes, my name is Sharita Hussein. I served in the military. I retired after 35 years. And I've always wanted to be a veteran of no wars or a veteran of peace. And so I have a couple of issues. So having been in Kuwait in 2004 when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke out, I was distraught because I felt like we threw out the Geneva Convention, just threw it out and didn't adhere to it. And then...
I'm not hearing very well, I'm sorry.
Okay, should I start over?
Are you closer to...
Okay, how's that? Much better?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I said I've served in the military for, I just retired after 35 years of service, and I was stationed in Kuwait in 2004. And I'm sort of giving you a little background for my question. In the Abu Ghraib scandal, I felt like somehow we threw out the Geneva Conventions. And now my concern is who in the international courts will, you know, call us up, call us out on this event. And then the other piece is the invasion of Iraq. I can understand perfectly well that we had an issue in Afghanistan to get Al-Qaeda, but for the invasion of Iraq, I felt we didn't have enough grounds. So again, if we are, again, who will hold us accountable for invading a country, even though we had a lot of support of other nations? So my concern is also with this concept of, I know I'm talking, giving you a broad brush here, sort of like if we look at the corporations that are benefiting from war, where is their responsibility in saying enough? And so I didn't hear much about the corporations' part as citizens and in this war. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, I hope I got the meaning of your question. Just on the last point, I know there is a tendency to think that these wars are for the benefit of corporations, and war for oil was, of course, the phrase that was so often used around the Iraq invasion. The president sort of brought it back to life when he said that we'll go in there and just take their oil. But I think the reality is that I don't think American corporations benefited from the Iraq invasion at all. Maybe a few of the manufacturers of military equipment, but we buy oil on the international markets like every other country, and of course now we actually export some. So I think it's too facile an assumption to think that these wars are driven by corporate greed and kind of a imperial economic instinct. I think Dr. King, in his Beyond Vietnam address, succumbed to that analysis a bit. And if I had any criticism of him, it would be that he kind of places the impetus for these military intervention policies a bit too much on the economic imperative. You know, that may have been a case, may have been the case more in American history in previous decades, but I don't see it as so much of a compelling force right now. I think it gets back to the question from the earlier, the student question about the cultural dynamics, the mindset that is so widespread in Washington, the whole set of bureaucratic institutions that surround the White House and Washington in general that are oriented towards the use of force, in which the decision-making apparatus is structured to rely upon the military. So I think those kind of institutional factors are as or more important than economic imperatives in leading to these armed conflicts. And in a way that makes it more difficult because we have just such an enormous job to do to try to diminish that institutional imperative, the kind of alternative government that exists in Washington. Some people call it invisible government, but it's very visible. You just drive around the Beltway and look at all the big contractor companies and all the many institutions around Washington. And it's grown enormously since 9/11. So we've gone backwards in terms of our national governance structure and the degree to which it is infused with military thinking and is dominated by military approaches to policymaking. The counterforce to that is, as I mentioned, the tremendous fatigue with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the sense that's growing even among some of our senior military officers that we need to find a better way, and that we cannot possibly allow ourselves to reduce our commitment to diplomacy and development and other tools of addressing international problems. And we need to have that more holistic approach.
I think this young lady had a question right here. And I'll be glad to take questions if I see hands, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Cortright. My name's Sasha. I'm a master's student at the Divinity School. When you were speaking about the importance of governance in conflict prevention and conflict resolution, you never used the word, as far as I can remember, you didn't use words like democratization or democracy building, but did say inclusiveness and participation as things that can be built in a society. I wonder, as we see the shift that may be coming with US contributions to peace operations being significantly cut, as well as humanitarian spending, and non-democratic countries like China may be stepping in to fill the gap. They're right now the second biggest contributor to peace operations. I wonder, could you speak to us about the importance of whether it's democratization as a country or these principles of these ideas of participation and inclusiveness, how necessary do you see these in conflict resolution? Can we have conflict resolution without these democratic principles?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I think it's a complex issue around the importance of democratization and how we as a country should support democratization around the world. Pippa Norris, in her work, has helped us to see that while democratization is certainly strongly associated with the prevention of armed conflict, there are places where we have stable societies that are relatively peaceful that are not democratic. We see this in East Asia in particular. There's talk about an East Asian zone of peace, but some of those countries are very autocratic, China and others. So we have to recognize that it's possible to have a relatively peaceful and stable society, even in the absence of democracy. On the other hand, we know that when democratization advances and reaches a high level of maturity, the work of Christian Davenport and others has shown that a high level of democracy is very strongly associated with prevention of armed conflict, with economic prosperity and development. So there's strong reason to be in support of democracy. Our framework on governance incorporates democracy, certainly, but as you say, we use the more holistic terms of inclusion, participation, accountability, equity, as ways of identifying qualities that are embedded in democracy, but not all can be in other kinds of regimes as well. Regime type is one of the variables, but it's a complex relationship. So I would say, yes, we should support democratization, and especially to help with the maturation of democracy. But we also have to recognize that when countries are coming out of autocracy and they have a low level of economic and social development and relatively immature institutional development, those countries are actually at a very high risk of armed conflict. This is the U-shaped curve that we see in social science, or the J curve, different ways of depicting it. But when countries are moving toward democracy in the early stages, when they have weak institutions and low levels of economic development, they are at high risk of armed conflict. So these are all complexities that we need to keep in mind as we think about promoting democracy. The idea that we could promote democracy through armed force, I hope, has been put to rest after the disasters of Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. I know it's still alive in some circles in Washington, but we should never entertain the notion that we can actually achieve mature democratization in the country through invasion and occupation for the current historical period. But we have many other tools, and the U.S. Endowment for Democracy has been important and has provided significant assistance around the world. Many of the development agencies, like Catholic Relief or Mercy Corps, do support citizen participation and inclusiveness at the local level as part of their projects to advance economic security and social development. So we can apply a holistic approach to development to incorporate inclusion, participation, accountability dimensions into these programs as a way of trying to build democracy from the bottom up, so to speak, and really help society to enhance social capital, the cohesion of society across different ethnic and other social divides, and in that way create a foundation for democracy that will enable it to be more sustainable into the future. But as we know, democratization takes a long time, has to grow from within. We can assist and help from the outside, and we should. but we can't force it, and certainly can't achieve democracy through bombing and invasion and occupation.
Gentleman here.
Hi, Dan Carmen with Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries and Interfaith Collaborative of Houses of Worships Uniting in Social Action. Sort of to bring the question back towards the what should sort of the local religious communities do. In your talk, you talked about building and fostering relationships and amongst each other, and then also sort of interacting with our local and state government, which is in fact happening here in Boston, and I would assume in most liberal pockets in the country. But as a result of that, what would you say beyond sort of interacting with our mayor, who is very supportive? Multiple mayors in our towns are very supportive in interacting with us. Our governor, Baker and Maura Healey are sort of very responsive of interacting with religious leaders. But what would you say beyond that, aside from working with the Mass Peace Action or Veterans for Peace and organizing another peace march or another lecture on nuclear disarmament or the International Peace Day in September? What would you say beyond that? Should we be sort of preaching from the pulpit, one might say, to sort of cultivate civic virtue and foster these this sort of upswell of wanting to do something?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and living there in Massachusetts, you're somewhat liberated tone, and so I recognize that you don't have to lobby Senator Markey on nuclear disarmament issues, for example. He was always our leader back in the days of the nuclear freeze. But I still think it's important for you to continue to raise your voices in the local settings and at the national level, and try to bring sound judgment and truth and scientific knowledge to the debate in Washington. It's so critically necessary now. I've been focusing a bit here in my remarks on these proposals to slash funding for development and for diplomacy and for social spending here at home while we build up the military side. I see this as really the critical battle that's going to be coming in the months ahead now. It'll be up to Congress to make these decisions. I'm sure the Massachusetts delegation will be on the right side of these issues, but I think we can but work in other states as well. During the election campaign, many of us went to neighboring states to do campaigning. In Indiana, we didn't have much chance of winning, so my wife and I went up to to Michigan. Went up to Michigan, knock on doors. Unsuccessful, but the idea was to try to do the work where it's most needed. And so I think you can try to be strategic about becoming engaged, and really to work in the areas where you can bring the greatest contribution. If you're a scientist, well, then you need to focus on the reality of climate change and the need to maintain funding for scientific research on climate and so many other issues. If you're in the social sciences, to talk about the development issues, political science to talk about the diplomacy, etc. We have great talents and great responsibility and a privilege, really, to be at a great university, to have the opportunity to study with the greatest minds and to learn. But with that comes then the responsibility to share and to find ways in which, especially at this time in our history, when we have a know-nothingness approach in our government, when science is being disregarded completely, when we need to bring our gifts, our knowledge into the debate and find ways in which we can insist upon the basic truths, the basic facts, unavoidable, but we need to bring that back to our political culture, to our politics. So I just say, stay engaged, stay involved over the long run. We're at quite a remarkable moment in the country. In response to Trump's election, there's been a mobilization of incredible dimension. The Women's March of the day after the election. More than 4 million people across the country engaged in actions at the local level. Quite spontaneous, not led by traditional organizations, but by groups that have appeared just for that purpose of the Women's March and for the struggles that lie ahead now. So let's stay engaged, stay active. Here in our little town of South Bend, we have a mobilization on Sunday, a town hall meeting to protect healthcare. Still a fight, and we need to keep these efforts going in every community. And as you pointed out, there'll be a number of marches in Washington, occasions when we can continue to lift up our voice. I think it can have some impact. You know, the Republican healthcare plan went down. Some of the president's policies have run into problems in the courts, and so, you know, these fights continuous. It looks gloomy at times, but all we can do is continue to raise our voices and speak the truth to power.
I've seen 2 questions left that I said I'd identify. I'll try and fit a third one in. We're running right up against time, and there's a plan to this program that you have to do more things, so I don't want to cut it off. I'm just directing traffic here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I am Wenceslao Bunge. I am from Argentina. I know quite a bit what you said, David, about Francis. I know that he is doing exactly what he did all his life since he was a priest. He didn't change a lot. The only thing that he did was just to do the same that he was doing in a local situation, just taking it to the world. I would like to thank you for that. I would like to thank you, Bryan. And I would like to thank you, of course, our Dean, David, too. And my question is, you're talking about a cultural shift. You're talking about a responsibility to protect. And we have that weapon that we are just attending here for religions and the practice of peace. My question is, it is possible to think that we will be able to bridge, I would say, let's put it like that, the Divinity School with United Nations in terms of having not just some countries intervening just because they think that they could do it under the umbrella of the United Nations, but to have just one United Nations troops. And those troops should be from very different nations and cultural backup. And could it be that a way to respond against what I remember in 2005, there was a summit in the United Nations after Rwanda. Canada present something that in some way you talk about. There was the responsibility to protect. And there was a summit, and it was just passed the whole assembly, but they couldn't be able to stop more Rwandas. There were several genocides, and the main thing, there was a lot of crimes against humanity. My question then is, it is possible to think about that bridge and having the United Nations having one single corps of military soldiers, not as belonging to one country, just having the white cascos, I don't know how you say casco.
Okay. David, I think needs to respond.
Yeah, I think the United Nations is critically important. I haven't talked about it, but international organization has to be essential to our vision of security, and we can't possibly solve the problems that we face in the world today as a nation by ourselves. This idea of America first is completely contrary to history and to evidence, and is a dangerous, misguided view of how to address international problems. So Americans don't remember that we actually, in the United States, our diplomats wrote the charter of the UN, mostly with the British, and we created the UN because we understood after World War II that we needed an international organization to help keep the peace and promote conditions for peace through development. And we need to come back to that understanding. Sadly, it's declined a great deal over the years, but it's our job to remind Americans and our fellow citizens that we need the UN. If it didn't exist, we'd have to create a new one. The more we can rely on the UN, the better off we'll be. When you talk about UN agreements, it's interesting that just this past week, there was the beginning of a process at the UN to try to develop a international convention to ban nuclear weapons. Just in the beginning stages, and of course the permanent 5 states, the nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, UK, France, and China, strongly objected to the idea of a treaty, but this is something that the General Assembly of the UN can do, and it looks like they are intending to do so. And I would expect sometime later this year we'll see an actual text come forward. And we know, of course, it's not going to magically get rid of nuclear weapons, but it does set a norm, it sets a standard that hopefully could steadily grow and become more important. So it's just one small example of the way in which the UN can be vitally important to the cause of international security and peace.
This lady in the front row, please.
Thank you, Dr. Cortright. My name is Judith Olson. I'm co-director of the program on religion and conflict transformation at BU's School of Theology. Used many of your books in my classes, and I appreciate your work. I feel we have such a sense of urgency with the nuclear arms buildup, and I have been reflecting on my own passivity in regard to this in the maybe past 10 or 20 years. When you were leading the same movement, and many of us were involved in that and the freeze movement, there was such a wide range of commitment to this. And I'm curious how you think we can resurrect that kind of mobilization again, particularly of people of faith, perhaps trying to build a coalition between progressive people of faith and people of faith who are very concerned about right-to-life issues.
I'd like the final question to be asked, and David, if you can respond to both of them.
Sure, that's fine.
It's actually very similar. It's also asking about how people, religious leaders, can address this. Several very controversial subjects were raised. A woman talked about Abu Ghraib and the terrible torture that happened there, and that now torture is a debatable subject in this country. And you mentioned that militarization, that is that the result of the reason for so many wars, and that perhaps it's a mindset that is the reason why we are so militarized, or perhaps it's the corporations that profit from military and they've helped create the mindset, or whether there was alluded to what's happening in Israel and Palestine, the occupation, and whether it's okay to either participate in BDS or it's okay to criticize the occupation. All these subjects are tremendously important in terms of human rights and peace and justice. And yet in our churches, church leaders often avoid these because they're sources of conflict. So you have heroes like Father Drynan, who left his job in order to address this. And yet these are, I think, many of us religious leaders who are passionate about this feel silenced within our churches in order to engage, to talk about this in the pulpit or engage in real conversations. So can you help
David, you've got
address
those
that?
two, and then we're going to go to Dean Hempton.
Sure. Sure, and I think there's a relation. I think the question about what kind of movements we can envision today around nuclear issues or these human rights and militarization issues. There's an interesting article that was in The Nation magazine a couple weeks ago and asked, what about the peace movement? Where is the peace movement? And there really isn't much of one compared to the Vietnam days or back in the nuclear freeze. On the other hand, there's, as I mentioned a moment ago, a huge mobilization going on across the country against the kind of extreme policies of the Trump administration. And I think, as I see it going forward, I don't think we're likely to be able to mobilize a big concern around nuclear weapons because there are so many other issues that people are fighting for and need to fight for. Most basically, healthcare, immigration, climate change, issues that are a grave threat to millions and millions of people and potentially to the whole planet. So I kind of have a sense of in which we can see ourselves as part of one big people's movement that will focus on particular issues. We're still in the healthcare fight and the immigration fight. But my guess is that these issues of budgets and military spending and nuclear issues will come back and we'll have a chance as a broader people's movement to focus there. Who knows what the president's going to do with Syria, but if he begins military action there and it goes badly, well, we may have to be out on the streets on that issue. So I think being flexible, being conscious of the different way in which movements are evolving today through social media without as much influence of the structured organizations like Peace Action or others, we can remain committed, work at local levels, and bring up and address issues as time arises. And I do think, to the second point, the role of the religious community remains essential. Yes, some of our churches and synagogues and mosques are conservative, they are reluctant to speak out on the pressing moral issues, but there are many that do. And even within your church or synagogue, or whatever it may be, you have a voice and you can speak out, and that can help to provide the necessary ethical and moral foundation for our movements. And also very critical, the continuing commitment to nonviolence. We've seen that our movements so far, since the Trump administration has come in, have been quite disciplined in the commitment to nonviolence for the most part. And we need to maintain that discipline. And there's no more important function or appropriate function, it seems to me, than to take that responsibility within the religious community to advocate for an ethical and normative approach to our resistance, knowing that it's not only the right thing to do morally, but it's more effective politically and pragmatically is more likely to bring about success and the kind of social political change that we strive to achieve.
I think it's my task to invite you to thank David for, as I said, a capacious address and then great generosity and insight in answering questions. Thank you very much, David.
Yes, I'd just like to add my thanks, David, for, I know this has been an extraordinary day for you. It must have begun pretty early and had many frustrations and difficulties, and I really appreciate you sticking with us right through the day and being willing to do this presentation by Skype. We're really tremendously grateful to you. Grateful not just for your stickability over the day, but for, I think, just presenting your accumulated wisdom of 50 years involved in peace building. So I've found this to be a serious and mature conversation that takes account of complexities and difficulties, where there's no easy fixes, where we've got to bring our best knowledge and our best energies and our best religious and ethical commitments to bear. I do sense from both the questions and our where we are at this point in our nation that there's a sense of things getting worse rather than better. The comments you made, Bryan, in your introduction about this Swedish data collection that over the past 5 years, the graph is going in the wrong direction in terms of world conflicts. So I think that your advice, David and Bryan, to stay engaged, the sense of urgency, the sense of being in this for the long haul and using our best knowledge are helpful things for us to understand. And I do think universities at Notre Dame and Harvard, BU, Georgetown, I think this is a moment when we've got to try and bring together the strengths that we have to try and make a difference in what's going to be, I think, a very difficult few years ahead. So thank you, David. Thank you, Bryan, for coming over and doing such an expert job of moderating, and thank you for all that you've done as well. So I also want to just thank the Carr Centre for being with us on this.